America's unsung, unknown, and possibly facing extermination. Heroes and heroines, the whistleblower. The topic of whistleblower came to the fore when I was directed to read an article that appeared in Forbes magazine earlier this month, which was titled, "A Barrage of Legal Threats Shuts Down Whistleblower Site Science Fraud." So in this piece, the author is rightfully horrified that science fraud, which in just 6 months of existence had caused suspect work in something like 300 peer-reviewed publications to be held up to the light of truth and found, seriously in some cases, wanting. And that's being polite. Now, once something like that happens, and if you happen to be the outed and aggrieved author, what do after you retract your dishonest work, of course? You sue, of course. Ergo, goodbye website. Well, when an equivalent scenario happens in a corporate or a governmental office where some form of wrongdoing is exposed, their weapon of choice is to fire or harass the troublemaker. And that's how it is. And why should you and I care? Why should an employer be allowed to fire someone who's revealed that which must be concealed story? There are reputations to be protected, grand missions to continue. Oh yes, and the bottom line, which has to be protected. So I decided to pose these questions to our 15 Minutes of Fact guest today, a woman who's been a whistleblower herself, but who then went on to found the Whistleblower Advocacy Group, whistlewatch.org, and the Brown Center for Public Policy. There, she and her team of experts work to educate the public on the importance of disclosures of violations of law or ethics, as well as provide services to whistleblowers. We find her at her home in Northern California by phone. Welcome to the show today, Evelynn Brown.
Good morning,
happy to have you with us.
Thank you for having me today.
Well, given the subject that we're talking about, we're very pleased to have you. So first, with your permission, I would like to let our listeners know a bit more about your pedigree. You're a public policy expert, background in law, and an advanced degree in human rights. You've worked in the field of child rights advocacy for 15 years and as a federal program officer. Quite impressive. But it provides me no clue as to how and why you came to be an advocate for and a defender of whistleblowers. So can you give us a little history on whistleblowing and how you became involved?
Certainly. Although I don't generally talk a lot about my own particular case, I'll give you a little bit of a background because I certainly came to this field earnestly. I was, as you mentioned, for about 15 years a child rights advocate and actually did some work on the Convention on the Rights of the Child for the American Bar Association, of which the United States at the time was not a member of that treaty. And as my career advanced, at one point I was approached to consider working for the federal government, particularly because a lot of federal employees were retiring out as baby boomers, and they wanted to bring in some individuals into the federal government that had expertise in education and a proven track record to replace some retiring employees. So I ended up taking a job with the Department of Health and Human Services, the Administration for Children and Families. I first worked in anti-human trafficking and then went on to grants policy and then into the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program. I transferred from Washington, D.C. out to back to California. So I worked in both D.C. as well as California for HHS. However, when I came to California, back to California, and worked as a federal program officer for the Runaway and Homeless Youth Program, I found some very disturbing information. And these were the kind of things that when you're talking about a very vulnerable population of children who have either fled their homes or fled foster homes and are living on the streets, protecting them is of the utmost import. What I found was, in review of what was going on in the West at first, what I believed only to be going on in the West at first, there were a number of grantees who had received multi-millions of dollars for many years who were, in fact, not providing any services to runaway and homeless youth. I know in New York City you have a tremendous problem, and as we do in many metropolitan cities, but even in rural areas there are children that need help. So in addition to going down the street one day trying to find an actual grantee in the Silicon Valley and find their address on their documents of where their runaway and homeless youth center was located, I could not find the address and that was listed on their documents, and came to find out that it hadn't existed for many years. However, the grantee continued to take funding. And this began to repeat itself at several grantees. When I would go to visit them, they simply did not have a program, yet they used the money, many times dumping it into their general funds, and this was several very well-known, high-profile grantees.
When you discovered this, did you immediately report this, or did you somehow try to get somebody to pay attention, or did you just sort of start accumulating this knowledge?
Now, I immediately, you can imagine what it was like, that when you have a new job, that you're trying to do a good job and that you're out actually visiting your essential clients. I mean, these are people that are using the taxpayers' money. And when you're a federal employee, you have a duty to protect the federal interest. And I was really rather shocked and surprised. And in addition to not finding grantees that actually had a program that were committing fraud, I also found a very disturbing trend that some grantees that did have some kind of a broken program, they were unlicensed by the states retrospectively to take care of children. So there were a number of disturbing trends that I immediately started to report to immediate supervisors.
Well, I can imagine they jumped right on that and immediately corrected this, right?
No, actually, what came to happen was that within a very short period of time, you're talking about a month or two, that I'm starting to discover these problems, and not just in California, but also in other states. And I go back to Washington, D.C. for a meeting and a training, and I'm pulled into an office with my then supervisor, who essentially threatens me and tells me that if I don't stop blowing the whistle on these problems, he's going to build a case to harm me personnel-wise.
And how far back was this?
This was in 2007.
Wow, not too far back, really.
No, and I was really pretty stunned because his attitude was he did not have an arm's-length relationship with these grantees. As a matter of fact, he was somewhat a personal friend of them, and I've even seen documents where he stayed at their summer homes in Florida and things like that. And his attitude was that bringing this all to light would possibly cut off the funding to some of these grantees committing fraud or violating state and federal law. And it was an attitude of the poor grantees, not the poor children.
You know, I'm really almost afraid to jump to the end of this by asking over what period of time did this take, and what was the final result? When did you walk out the door unhappy, or did anything happen of any value?
Sadly, I would say that when that attitude of my then supervisor appeared and some other management individuals, I then went to the Office of the Inspector General. I had already started making a series of reports to the Office of Inspector General, and as well as fiscal people, that this was a serious problem that was just starting to expand. It turned out that the problem existed all over the country, and filtered into other grant programs, even into Head Start programs. And so I began to work with the Office of the Inspector General. I, of course, went up the chain of command and reported that I was being threatened and on what circumstances. I then made disclosures to the Office of Special Counsel, which is the small federal agency that protects federal employees from whistleblower retaliation. I ended up with a case at the Merit System Protection Board. This extended for the retaliation became extremely severe. At one point, even a couple members of Congress were notified. They tried to get involved. The retaliation from my management simply began to literally pour on. And during that last year of the Bush administration, and we all know since we just went through another presidential election, that, what's most important is you don't ever expose the current administration, and embarrass them or show that they're actually not really working for the people. And, the Department of Health and Human Services is who provides health care to the entire nation. So this problem expanded, unfortunately, during the Scott Block era at the Office of Special Counsel. Federal whistleblowers were certainly not protected. They certainly were not protected at the Merit System Protection Board whatsoever. I had an EEOC case also as well. People have to understand that when you're a federal employee, you're kind of locked into a quagmire of administrative procedures. You don't have a right to go out to the regular court systems and sue for being harassed or threatened, or ultimately for me.
I hate to tell you this. Evie, do you mind if I call you that? Evie?
Yes, please do.
Okay, Evie. It's hard for me or anybody listening to imagine that anything could be more important or beneficial to society and its businesses and government than to have them held accountable. Now, the sad thing that I'm getting out of this is that it seems almost a hopeless situation. Inside a government, you're bogged down. Outside the government, you don't have much support, and you can't even be guaranteed of a job to survive on while you're making these complaints. So, given the fact that you were willing to put up with that, and given the fact that you continued to go forward and eventually to found your own organization, not all of the benefits of whistleblowing can be quantified. So, in your mind, given the challenges that you face and that you know that others face, what is the most important public benefit of whistleblowing?
Well, the bottom line here is this, and we all depend on the kindness of strangers, to take something directly out of an old movie, which is that we all are so intricately dependent on others being able to speak up on our behalf to protect us. And then when it comes to taxpayer money, or it comes down to public health and safety problems, dangers to the public health and safety should be of everyone's attention. All the public really needs to understand that there are people who, simply for the purpose of making sure that they will protect others, will step forward and will sacrifice greatly. Without them, we really are left with exactly what happened in the financial collapse here in this country, and mortgage fraud and SEC violations.
That's right. Where exactly? Where were the whistleblowers? How could these people be encouraged to come out? How can they be protected from retribution? Now, in my experience, few people are aware of the history of whistleblowing in this country and how important it's been really down through our history. In fact, one of the first laws enacted to protect whistleblowers came about during the Civil War, where they had the 1863 United States False Claims Act. That dealt with combating fraud by companies supplying the war effort.
Correct.
Does that have a familiar sound?
It really does, and Americans really, this is so ingrained with us. We could even go back further. You can go back to, the taxes on tea. You could go back to individual liberties of religion and freedom of speech. I mean, we as Americans, we really are whistleblowers. We have always taken a leadership role in protecting human rights. And on the False Claims Act, the Civil War in the United States could have gone very differently if it hadn't been for the fact that whistleblowers were coming to President Lincoln and saying The Union troops are not getting their supplies of meat. They're not getting their uniforms. They're not getting their blankets. They're getting faulty rifles. I mean, you had a group of people that were contractors to the United States government that were basically ripping off the government. And, you know, President Lincoln stood up and said, no, we're not going to do this. And as a matter of fact, it is so important that we have people that come and tell that the government is being ripped off. You know, he enacted by executive order the False Claims Act that we still have today.
This is one of the early uses of executive order, which obviously did not please a lot of members of Congress whose hands were in the till as well.
Yeah, but eventually, you know, these things do. The law is always the last of the party, quite frankly. You know, it's really because of a grassroots effort, a groundswell effort, that the public actually changes the way that we operate and how we're going to operate in the future. We see that in civil rights. We see that in environmental law. We see that in pharma.
We see that in the Occupy Wall Street movement.
Absolutely.
There's no doubt. So then my question next is, what is the role of government in protecting workers, especially whistleblowers?
Well, let me talk about something that I believe is really important for the public to pay attention to. We've got a lot of money. All our tax dollars is going into running government, and government is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It may not be getting more and more efficient. One of the things that is really vitally important is that we pay attention to the fact that federal employees work for the federal government. They work actually for the taxpayers. They need to be protected. They are often the first to learn about fraud, waste, abuse, mismanagement, dangers to public health and safety. And if they are not protected, what interest do they have in protecting the public? For example, if you're a SEC lawyer, for example, like Gary Aguirre or Darcy Flynn, and you find out that there is wrongdoing going on within the SEC, and they're not paying attention to example, for banking or investments, and you speak up as a federal employee and say, hey, something's wrong over here. Wait a minute. We have got to fix this. And you end up being, like I was, you end up being fired by the federal government because you're either embarrassing the administration or you're talking about the mismanagement within a federal agency, and you are the whistleblower. We know the cascade, the avalanche that fell because we weren't paying attention to what was going on Wall Street. This repeats itself over and over and over again. Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Defense. We could just go on and on. Whatever department.
Well, we could. So, obviously, I can understand better how government needs to be involved and it needs to be protecting us from itself. But what about the rest of us? None of us have a blog or a radio program or write for major magazines like this fellow did for Forbes. So, as citizens, are we relegated to being onlookers, or is there anything that the public can do to be more actively involved?
The public needs to be more actively involved. The public, first of all, let me say this. The public is always actively involved and actively engaged. We all do it for ourselves, our neighbors, our family. We blow the whistle every single day. We would never dream of letting a child run into the street and be run over. We stop, we say, we look, we see things that happen. We don't even allow an animal to be mistreated. That's whistleblowing. That's in its simplest form. We all do it, but we all have to have our eyes on the government, because the way things are going, and especially right now where we don't even have our intelligence community whistleblowers protected in the same sense that other federal employees are protected, there's just too much being covered up, too much silencing of people, not enough encouragement of having the people that work for the taxpayers actually have the proper channels and outlets to be able to blow the whistle, and where are they going to go?
Okay.
We have to have this attitude. One of the things I'd like the public to pay attention to is the Office of Special Counsel and their performance of protecting federal whistleblowers, as well as the Merit System Protection Board, and then the upper courts. If you're not paying attention to that, then you're talking about the federal government is mandated by law under equal employment opportunity to be a model employer for industry.
Well, what? Wait. Hold on for a second. What you're saying is that people should do this and they should do that. Even as Occupy, for example, in which I participate, we're in the minority. Yet I know that we're making a difference. I know that we are watching the people that need to be watched, and we're making this very public. What other groups should get involved, and what is the downside of the public doesn't maintain that vigilance?
Well, some of the other groups that really should be more actively involved, in my opinion, is any kind of civil liberties group. Unions should be paying attention to what's going on. Any kind of groups that promote free speech. Journalists need to pay attention. You can't control, the media and journalism and really have a free society too. We have to have scientists. The way you broke open your program here, what in the world is going on here when we have a brand new website that's going to talk about science fraud that has to close up shop because they're being threatened with lawsuits. That's not good.
Evie, I cannot thank you enough for what you've been providing in our what we euphemistically call 15 minutes of fact, which actually could go on for 15 hours in your case. But what you're doing for the listeners and the fans of 15 minutes of facts and WGRN radio, by your education, your encouragement is very important. So I want our listeners out there to know more about you and where to find you. So you can find Evelynn Brown, and by the way, that's with two N's. It's Evellynn Brown, BROWN, by way of email at EvyBrown@gmail.com. On LinkedIn as Evelynn Brown, on Twitter as @EvyBrown, and at her own website, whistlewatch.org. So I'm going to ask you to leave one thought with us, Evie, and that is just exactly what is your organization doing that we need to know about?
Well, the biggest thing that we're probably doing is attempting to really work with the public and educate them so that they will learn why it is so important to applaud and encourage active whistleblowing and to thank the people who stood up and put their careers on the line in order to protect the public. And we also offer total support services, including legal, for any whistleblowers. They can contact us for confidential disclosures. We also, quite frankly, offer to businesses ways to help them really promote active ethical conduct. And we're welcome anyone who would like to collaborate with us and work with us to protect the public.
I have a feeling you'll get some response on that, Evie. This is Jerry Ashton of 15 Minutes of Fact here on WGRNradio.com, thanking Evelynn Brown once again, as well as our fans for stopping by to learn more about positive social change and those who have something of value to say about it, and most importantly, those like Evelynn Brown are doing something about it. Talk to you the next time.
Thank you, Jerry.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.